Hi YouTubers out there, this is Fortune Cookie 45 LC coming to you on the subject of the Ruger Super Blackhawk. Now the 44 Magnum Blackhawk first came out in 1956, and originally it was hard to control because of the recoil. So in 1959 Ruger brought out the Super Blackhawk, and here are two examples of the Super Blackhawk. Now the difference between the Blackhawk 44 Magnum and the Super Blackhawk was that instead of the grip frame being made of aluminum alloy and the ejector rod also an aluminum alloy, steel was used for the grip frame and the ejector rod housing, and the cylinder was not fluted. And this would increase the weight of the Super Blackhawk to better control the recoil. Also, the grip frame used a square back. Now this is the old model Super Blackhawk, and this is a new model. The old model Blackhawk belongs to an acquaintance of mine, and the history on this is that he purchased this Super Blackhawk back in 1972, which is the last year of the old model. But in those days, the Super Blackhawk, the old models were very well polished, and the bluing was very deep. Better than the bluing finishes of today's new model Blackhawks. There are 3 screws, which is the old model, and the problem with the old model was that it was patterned after the working of the Colt, so that when you open the loading gate, now these revolvers have been cleared for cartridges, they're unloaded, they've been already checked. But the way that the old model worked was you would cock the hammer back 2 clicks to free up the cylinder so that you could then load the revolver. Now the old model had the reverse pulse so that every chamber lined up on the click, so that there wasn't any problem loading the revolver. You could do it with your eyes closed because you would click and back it up until the chamber was lined up with the loading gate and drop your cartridges in. Typically we would load 1, then skip a chamber, and then load 4, followed by going to full cock and lowering the hammer, and that would put you on the empty chamber and you could carry it that way. Now on many occasions I went out with my acquaintance and we shot this revolver. Typically he would go to the range and he'd fire 200 rounds at a time, 100 rounds of full power Keith loads. The classic Keith load was 22 grains of 2400 powder with a 245 or 240 grain Keith style semi-wad cutter bullet. And I recall that he'd shoot these full power loads, and then he'd have to tighten up this screw and tighten up these screws because they would be loose after every 30 rounds or so. They would loosen. So he had the screwdriver going all the time, tightening up these screws, and this revolver has been fired thousands of times in its lifetime, and it's still in very good condition. So if you look at that, it's doing very well. But Ruger offered a program where you could send in for parts, or they would actually change the parts out if you sent them the gun, and they'd send you the original parts back along with the new parts to make it into a new model Super Blackhawk. And the new model came out in 1973, so this was purchased in 1972. It is one of the last of the old model Super Blackhawks. But once again, it's in very good condition. Now the new model came out in 1973, and this is my Super Blackhawk. It was purchased about 3 years ago. So it's a new model. And the new model, once again, the difference is that you don't have to go to 2 clicks on the hammer to free up the cylinder anymore. All you have to do is open the loading gate. And when you do that, the cylinder is free to turn. But it doesn't have the reverse pawl, so that if you go to a click, you can't drop the round in. You have to visually look at it to advance the next open chamber to drop the rounds in to load. And unloading, same thing. You've got to line it up to work the ejector rod. Whereas with the old model, the reverse pawl, you just go to the next click and you're right there. You're lined up, so that you could unload or load without having to really look at it. But here you have to look at it. It's a little bit of an inconvenience, but it's still fine. But the advantage of the new model is that it has the transfer bar, so that there's no way the firing pin can be in contact with the primer as with the old model. So that if you release the trigger and the hammer is down, you could have a loaded round underneath the firing pin hit this hammer. It would not go off, because unless the transfer bar is in its upward position, there's no contact with the firing pin. So the new model is safer. The finish is not as good as the old model, but otherwise the revolvers are the same size, frame, weight. The weight of this is almost 3 pounds. It has the flat, the squared off trigger guard like the old model. This was so that in recoil the middle finger of the shooting hand wouldn't get banged by the recoil. But the whole grips make this a very pleasant revolver to shoot. So my acquaintance put a set of Harriet stocks on it for many years, and recently he switched to the Hogue as well, so I've got some Hogue on mine, making this this almost a match set. My friend did not want to send in to have his old model converted, because the feeling is that it's more collectible with the old model setup. But he's actually not shooting this revolver too much now, because he's keeping it for its collector value. 44 Magnum is an amazingly versatile cartridge. There are loads that are really soft, like cowboy loads that hardly recoil at all, like feel like 38s, all the way up to the real heavy loads that will penetrate big game. And there's many jacketed rounds that are suitable for use up to deer size, mule deer size game. And even though the 44 Magnum has stout recoil, it's very manageable for most shooters. So here's your Super Blackhawk. All you YouTubers out there, have a very nice day, and we'll see you again.